Hey, well, good afternoon. I'm so glad to see you guys here today as we have, I think, actually just two more lessons that we're going to be doing for this semester. And we've been working, in case you don't know, through this test prep book. This is one of the most commonly used test prep books in world history, the AMSCO World History Modern. And so, one of the good things about the coronavirus is that they have actually cut material from the AP exam for 2020. So nothing in the 20th century will be on that exam, which is really great news for us, which means it's stuff that we don't have to worry about, things that we don't have to do. So we're just going to wait for a little bit of people to be getting on. I hope you like this. I got this given to me for teacher appreciation. Another good thing about the AP test is we learned that last week, I think AP US History had their test, and it turns out that for their one question test, the students were given 4 prompts. And that's really good news because that gets us some information about what we can expect on Thursday, that we probably will also get 4 prompts. We'll get multiple choices as far as what we want to write about. And that's really great news for us that we have those choices. Also, there's a lot of different YouTube pages doing live reviews. In fact, at 2 o'clock, I think, Central Time, there's going to be a live YouTube review session. I posted another page on the Remind account. So those are all really great things that I would take advantage of if you have the time. And based on how many of you are doing your AP World History assignments now, it seems like some of you have a lot of time because I mentioned the other day that 40% of us are not turning in any assignments. So hopefully that gets rectified. So with 2 lessons left, let's get this lesson down. Our handout is called Immigrants, Emigrants, and Migration. An immigrant is someone who enters in a country. An emigrant is someone who leaves a country. And so we're going to be talking about how the Industrial Revolution, about how imperialism, how all these things even tie in with this theme of migration. And so that's our focus today. That's what we're going to be talking about. And it says on our handout, there's migration through labor systems. And the Industrial Revolution impacted economic imperialism. That's one of the themes that we've been talking about the last few days, is economic imperialism. We've mentioned the fact that there is actual imperialism where like people groups are being conquered and people groups are being taken. Also this other element of economic imperialism where I don't even have to like physically conquer and take you over to dominate you. In fact, we see that happening a lot. It says on the handout that the Industrial Revolution had impacted in economic imperialism in 2 ways. One was that there was a desire to exploit natural resources. There was a desire to exploit natural resources. And this is not like a new thing. We've talked a lot about this, there's natural resources in Central Africa. There's rubber, there's palm oil. We want access to that. There's natural resources in different parts of the world, and we want access, Europeans and Americans argued, and we might have to push around or beat up some developing nations to get access to that. And number 2, that's great having natural resources, but now, how are we going to actually, now we have access, how are we going to get those things to market? So number 2 is the desire to access low-wage labor. And this could actually be even no-wage labor. We've looked at pictures and examples of like people harvesting like rubber in the Congo, and how King Leopold II of Belgium, how he instituted this policy where if Congolese workers in Central Africa weren't like bringing enough rubber, they just literally chopped off their hands. And that is an example of low wage / no wage labor. And we see other examples of that as well that we'll be kind of talking about today. And one of the things that kind of drew this low-wage labor desire at the end of the 19th century was that the 19th century saw the abolition of slavery. That slavery, you know, we talked about slavery as a thing from the 15, 16, 17 to the 1800s, and slavery was driven as a result of the Columbian Exchange. You know, they discovered the Americas, and they discovered that there's a lot of profits to be made growing things like sugarcane, but that sugarcane's not going to grow and harvest itself, right? We also see with the invention of like the cotton gin that it becomes cheaper and more profitable to grow and sell cotton. I can grow it in Georgia, I can sell it abroad. We have these factories, these industrial factories that can process it cheap. So we see slavery was a huge part of the global economy, the 15s and going all the way to the 1800s. But now, in the 1800s, abolition has gotten rid of slavery. And it gets rid of slavery in different times, in different places. On the handout, it points out 1865. That's when we, the United States, we got rid of slavery. It took a civil war. It took, one of the bloodiest conflicts we in the United States have ever experienced. Our country's social fabric was torn apart. That's what it took to get rid of slavery in our country. In other areas, it took a bit longer. In fact, the next date is 1886. That's how long slavery was still practiced in Cuba. 1886 was Cuba. And the last country in the Western Hemisphere to have slavery, 1888, that's Brazil. And so you see slavery, it holds on in different places in different times. We've also studied another lecture that slavery continued. In fact, even to the 20th century. Some countries like Mauritania, which is a North African country, I don't think they got rid of, or a West African country, I don't think they got rid of slavery until like the 1980s, in my lifetime. And of course, that's just the legal practice. It's still practiced today, sadly, all around the world. So now what do I do? Western economies wondered, when we depended so much on slave labor and now slavery is gone. What do we do now that that's a thing? So it says that there was still a demand for the main product of slave labor, and that's agricultural products. Agricultural products. So that's the thing. It's like, we're in this bind, we're in this situation that we have had slave labor driving Western economies from the 1500s to the 1800s. We've abolished slavery. Slavery is gone, but we still have a desire for cotton and sugar and bananas and all these different things that I easily had slaves do. Well, how do we solve that problem? Abolition becomes a problem in the minds of many. It says that Europeans still needed plantation workers, so they began recruiting new plantation workers. We still need these workers. And so now Europeans, and to a degree Americans, are going to be looking to other groups of people to work these plantations. And these groups of people that they're going to bring in are not white Europeans for the most part. There are some limited examples of that, but really for the most part, it's not white European background people. The most common substitute for slave labor are two groups of people that are going to be brought in. They're going to be brought in Latin America. They're going to be brought into the Caribbean. They'll be brought in parts of Asia. And those are going to be Chinese and Indians. Chinese and Indians. Both of these groups are having population explosions to some degree. Both of these groups, Chinese and Indians, are seeing a lot of people looking to escape either warfare or political instability or poverty, And these groups of people, Indians and Chinese, are like the two most common replacements that we'll see for Black slave labor. Europeans from 1847 to 1874 enticed 500,000 to move from China. 500,000 to move from China. So these are huge numbers, 500,000 people from China alone are entering into these global economy that they wouldn't have otherwise. If there was no abolition of slavery, it probably would have been hard. It probably would have been more difficult for 500,000 Chinese to enter into the global market. And whenever you have so many people moving, what's going to move with them? Their culture is going to move with them. What's going to move with them? elements of their old country. And a lot of people thought, you know what, I'm going to move to America, I'm going to move to Peru for a short amount of time, and then I'm going to leave. I'm going back home. And for many, that never happened. You know, for me, myself, you know, I grew up in El Paso, Texas, went to Austin for 6 years after high school, and I moved to Houston in 2002. And I thought, I'm probably going to live in Houston for 4 or 5 years and move back to Austin. Well, I've been here since 2002. I have not moved back. And we see that same pattern in these global migrations. You know, we're going to see that people from Italy, people from China, people from India thought, well, I'm going to go work and make some money, send back money to my family, and then go back home. And for many, they never made it back home. It says the British brought in migrants to work in places like the Caribbean, places like in South Africa, places like East Africa. All these places, they brought in people from India. And to this day, you still see this presence of an Indian population in East Africa. You know, Indians are an important part of the East African economy. Indians are business leaders. In fact, this caused a big problem in Uganda. As an example, there was a crazy dictator, a guy named Idi Amin. He killed thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of his own people, and he blamed outsiders. Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda, actually kicked out all the Indians. I think he gave them like 48 hours and said, listen, you got 2 days. You guys are not from Uganda. You're basically stealing from Uganda. 2 days, you need to leave. And he kicked out all the Indians. And that was disastrous for Uganda because these were business leaders. These were wise bankers, you know, and we still see them. You know, now Uganda has gone back from that dictatorial time, and we still see Indians, important business leaders. When I was in Rwanda last summer, many of the bankers that I dealt with were Indian owners. You know, they were from India, and they thought, you know, I'm never going to move back to India. And so we see a lot of this Indian presence in East Africa to this day, and in other parts of the world as well. It says the percent of the Indian population today, and in fact, you know, one of the areas, not only is it East Africa, but in the Caribbean as well. Here's 3 Caribbean nations. The one is Trinidad and Tobago. And Trinidad and Tobago, this is an island nation in the Caribbean. 35% of Trinidad and Tobago have Indian ethnic background. Now, not Native American. Like sometimes the terminology can get confusing. We say Indian, you think like cowboys and Indians or the Cherokee. But here I'm talking about Indians from India. And so sometimes, you know, even in our community in Houston, you meet someone and, you know, sometimes we try to like put people into broad racial categories. The Indians, you know, sometimes you meet someone and think, okay, well, these people are Indian. You think they're from India, but there's thousands of people who have Indian descent, and they're really just from the Caribbean. That's who they are. That's where they're from. Guyana, this is a region on the northern coast of South America, and 40% of the people there are Indian. And Suriname is also in the northern coast of South America, and 27% of them have an Indian population. 27% of them have an Indian population. So we see a lot of Indian presence in the Caribbean. We see it in the pictures we have. We see all of this here. California and British Malaysia also see huge amounts of migrants from China. The Chinese also are also, you know, huge amount of workers that we see, you know, doing construction in California and other places. And you know, that's a huge deal, right? It's not just the Indians; it's also the Chinese. They worked on railroads. We've talked about this theme before. We've talked about that theme before. And how many Chinese moved to Cuba? About 125,000. 125,000 moved from China to Cuba alone. And we don't really think about China as being like this huge uh, place that is going to send people to Cuba. But you know what? Cuba had depended on slave labor. With the abolition of slavery, that goes away, and we have Chinese people harvesting sugarcane in Cuba. Hawaii, Peru, and Cuba saw migrants from Japan. Hawaii, Peru, and Cuba see a lot of migrants from Japan also. And here's a photograph on your notes of President Alberto Fujimori. And from 1990, I think there's a typo that's like 95 to 2000, he was the first president of Japanese heritage in Peru. And so even to this day, there are a lot of people in countries like Peru that have Japanese heritage. And that's this example here that we have. We have all this multiculturalism, we have all these changes that have occurred. It says that these Japanese in places like Peru, these Japanese in places like the Caribbeans, they worked on sugar plantations. And again, this was work that was previously done by slaves, and now it's being done by Japanese in South America, Japanese in the Caribbean. Many of these laborers came as indentured servants, And, slavery is not technically a thing. Slavery is not something that is allowed, but the way that they're treated, even though they're technically what's called indentured servants, it's not going to be right the way that they're treated. In fact, some returned home, but many stayed. Many had thought, you know what we're going to do? We're going to work for a few years, we're going to go home, but actually many stayed. And thus we see in the Caribbean a very high Indian influence, where many people that I have met that I know have Indian heritage, when I talk a little bit farther, it's like, well, actually they do have Indian heritage, but they're from the islands. They're from the Caribbean, and they don't actually even have any living relatives that are from India, like directly. And so the Caribbean is a place that some people are surprised that many Indian heritage people that they know, they don't have anyone in their family they can point to that was born in India, but they were in fact from the Caribbean. So we see a huge Indian influence in the Caribbean. These Asian workers were not slaves, but they were exploited. So they're not slave labor, but they were exploited. And so that is not a good thing. It's not something that is great, but we do see these Western economies still wanting to produce all the things that they were producing before. So that's some Asian examples of migration, people choosing to migrate for opportunities, even sometimes if they chose to migrate and got a bad deal. But there's other people who are forced to move, and so we'll talk now about British penal colonies. And so a penal colony is a colony that is for prisoners. You're being penalized. A penal colony is where people are being penalized and they're sent to these jails, they're sent to these prisons. And Australia was a new home for these British prisoners. The British had experienced some population growth. There was actually not enough room for the perception was that there wasn't enough room to fill their jails. They put people like on boats as prisons. And they thought, Australia is the perfect place, especially because they lost their original place to send all their prisoners. Most prisoners had been sent to the 13 colonies. So we have these 13 colonies. The United States is what they would become. And they sent their prisoners to places like Georgia. But what happened after 1776? Well, there's no more 13 colonies. I can't send them to Georgia anymore. And so those prisoners need a new home. Australia was the new home after the American Revolution. Australia was the new home after the American Revolution. And how long did it take to get to Australia? I mean, if you were a prisoner and you were sent off this boat all the way to Australia, you're talking about 252 days. That's how long it would take from you leaving England to getting to Australia by boat, 252 days. That is a huge trip. How many were sent on these voyages? Well, convicts transported, there was about 160,000. There was about 160,000 that were sent on these voyages, on these trips. And in fact, today, if you were to take a poll of modern day Australians and figure out how many of them have ancestors that had gone to jail, and that's like, how did you get here? Well, my great great grandpa was a prisoner. Modern Australians that are descended from transported convicts, about 20%, about 20% of all those people transported are from convicts. And what did they do when they got to Australia? Well, most performed manual labor. That's what most people did. Most people performed manual labor. After years of service, most earned their freedom. So, they were sent to Australia as prisoners. They were sent there doing, this manual labor, but after they did their work, most of them got their freedom. And because the distance was so great, remember I told you that it was 252 days just to get there. It was like almost a year trip just to get there. Because it was so great, even after I got my freedom, most just decided that they would stay. Most stayed. After 1851, many people began to move to Australia after the discovery of gold. And so, before that time period, people did not want to move to Australia just, for their health. I mean, it's a crazy distance to travel. People were going there because they were forced to go there. But after gold was discovered, people are a lot more willing to go to Australia than ever before. And it wasn't just white people who were going. Other people were too. In fact, this included 50,000 Chinese people. 50,000 Chinese people went to Australia to try to take advantage of these gold strikes. So moving away from Australia, let's talk a little bit about another penal colony. This is in South America. The French South American colony of Guyana, and there's a map we have, and if you look at this map, South America, Guyana is north of Brazil. So there's like these three small countries on the northern coast of South America. There's Venezuela, which is pretty big. And then there is Guyana, there's Suriname, and then there's French Guyana. And this is the area that we're talking about, this French colony on the northern coast of South America, north of Brazil. And actually, this is still not an independent. This is the only part of South America that is not independent. Today, it is part of France. Today, this part of South America is actually still part of France. If you travel to French Guyana, you are actually traveling to France. It's the only part of South America that is in the EU. The EU is the European Union, and this part of South America to this day, it's part of the EU, which means when you go to South America, if you go to French Guyana, the money used there is the euro. They're using the European money because they're not an independent nation. They're not an independent country. They're actually part of the European Union. And so they still have this connection to this day. They were definitely they were served as a penal colony. And they were a penal colony all the way until the last prisoners were held there in 1953. 1953. So two examples of how white people move to different parts of the world. They're moving to Australia, they're moving to South America. In these cases, forced to move there. They're not moving by choice. So migration in the face of challenges. So there's a word that describes the mass migration of a people group from their home region. And this is a word that we've used before. This is the word diaspora. One of the most famous diasporas is the Jewish diaspora. Jews were kicked out of their homeland in the year 70 and their temple was destroyed. And this is why a Middle Eastern people, the Jews, end up getting dispersed everywhere. There's Jews all over the world because they're kicked out of their homeland. They were forced out. There's also the African diaspora, which we've talked about before. Africans, also millions and millions forced out of their homeland. But we can use that word diaspora to discuss the Vietnamese diaspora after the fall of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War, and how Vietnamese have come to the United States by the thousands and thousands of people. So just the word diaspora means dispersal of people group from like their homelands. And one of the largest, it says in a handout, forced movements in world history was due to slavery. And that was, as we mentioned just a moment ago, the African diaspora. So that's a word that you should be familiar with. It's a good, smart person word, the African diaspora. There's other diasporas that we should take note of. And the second diaspora we should take note of by name is the Indian diaspora. And it says that the Indian diaspora in the 19th century was due to poverty, that Indians didn't have money, they didn't have jobs, they didn't have any sort of, many of them didn't have opportunities. And so they saw working in South America or working in the Caribbean or working in British colonies in East Africa as an opportunity for them. So poverty was one of the driving factors that pushed them into diaspora. Working in British plantations on 5-year contracts, these indentured laborers will write down numbered 1.5 million. So, I mean, that's significant. 1.5 million Indians leaving their home and bringing with them their culture, their language, their cuisine, their music, and even their religion. 1.5 million of them. The Chinese diaspora included many of those who would work on the railroad. And we've mentioned the Transcontinental Railroad before. A lot of those workers who built the railroad that made Manifest Destiny a thing were not white Americans, but they were Chinese from the other side of the world. So Chinese diaspora included many who came to work on the rail. Most were males who planned to return back to China. And some did, but again, many stayed, which is why we actually have such a huge percentage of Chinese in California, because it's the farthest west the continental United States goes. It's where there was gold mining in 1849. There was the rail construction. A lot of these guys intended to return, but a lot of them ended up staying. Many fled China due to poverty or to escape the violence of something we did in a previous lecture called the Taiping Rebellion. It's a black bold letter vocabulary word. You might remember that there was this crazy civil war, killed like 20 million people, and it was led by a guy who claimed he was the Chinese brother of Jesus Christ. That there was this guy who said he was Jesus's Chinese little brother. He believed that he had these encounters and experiences, that he was the Chinese brother of Jesus Christ. And so that had caused this crazy civil war, like 20 million people died. A lot of people said, look, we're just going to leave. We're just going to flee. The final thing, and then after that, there's the Irish diaspora. This is a result of people fleeing poverty and persecution. The Irish have not had it easy, and so millions leave to escape poverty and persecution. Poverty and persecution. To be Irish is to be discriminated against. To be Irish is to have your land taken away by the English. To be Irish is to be abused in your own land for being Catholic. It's a rough go for the Irish people. In fact, there was also, you might remember, a potato problem that the Irish were eating and depending so much on the potato in their daily diets that when there was a disease that wiped out the potato, it also wiped out the Irish people. This great famine killed 1 million Irish people. 1 million Irish people died in this great famine. And so a lot of them said, well, we need some options. We need to go somewhere. And they weren't forced to go, but they chose to go to places like the United States. In fact, how many Irish came to the United States? 5 million Irish people came to the United States. 5 million. In today's world, in the 21st century, people worldwide who claim Irish descent is about 80 million people. And that's pretty impressive that there's 80 million people who have some Irish blood running through their veins. In the United States, those who claim Irish heritage in our country is about 36 million people. That's like the population of Texas. And that's a huge thing. 36 million Americans have Irish blood to some percent running through their veins. In fact, American presidents who've had Irish heritage, there's actually 12 U.S. presidents that have Irish heritage. A lot of people think of like JFK as like, and John F. Kennedy is like the best example of this like president with Irish heritage, but people forget the most recent president with Irish heritage, which was President Obama. And there's this famous picture when President Obama actually went to Ireland that he met with one of his cousins, and he had like a Guinness beer, this iconic Irish beer, with his cousin. People, know that Obama's dad is Kenyan, his last name is Kenyan, all that good stuff, but they forget for some reason that yes, Obama was, black, but his mom is white. Barack Obama never lived with his dad. He was raised by his white mom. He lived with his white grandparents. Barack Obama grew up in an all-white house, and his white mom, that's half of who he is, and her background is Irish. And so they've actually found pictures of Barack Obama's Irish ancestor, and they've traced it down of his Irishness. And so there's a famous picture there of Barack Obama's, let's see, 5 generations back. 5 generations back, Barack Obama's ancestors are 100% Irish. And so they still, warmly welcome him in that way. Another group of people who escaped poverty were not just the Irish, but the Italians. 7 million Italians left Italy. Poverty and Italy, 7 million left. How many, and there's a typo here, how many Americans claim Italian heritage? I think it may say Irish heritage, but it should say Italian heritage. There's about 15 million Italian Americans in the United States today. Some of these are people who are super famous that you've heard of. There's a guy named Rudy Giuliani. You might have heard of him because he was like the famous mayor of New York City during 9/11. He's also like Donald Trump's personal lawyer, and he kind of says kind of weird stuff from time to time nowadays, but he's super famous and one of New York City's most famous mayors, especially because of 9/11. He was the mayor during 9/11 and was thought to have done a really good job at the time. Also, Nancy Pelosi, she's super famous Italian. She's the Speaker of the House. She's one of the most powerful people in the United States in 2020. She's the head Democrat, and so people love Nancy or they hate her. She is super famous as well. Christie, he's the former governor of New Jersey. He actually ran for president as a Republican. He's super duper famous as well. There's a guy that people also love to hate. This is Bill de Blasio, and he's currently the mayor of New York. And in 2020, people have all kinds of opinions and thoughts about him doing like a terrible job about the coronavirus or doing the best he can for coronavirus, etc. So that's Bill de Blasio. He's one of the most famous politicians in the United States. He's the mayor of New York. And then there's these other two guys, Scalia and Alito, and they are actually on the Supreme Court. And so we have 2 Italians, Americans, on the Supreme Court, Scalia and Alito. And then there's this last guy, Anthony Fauci. And I hope / think that you've heard of Anthony Fauci. He's actually the medical expert leading the COVID-19 response. Anytime Donald Trump has a press conference, Anthony Fauci is like the guy who he brings out, and he's actually really well respected. Democrats love Fauci, Republicans love Fauci for the most part. He's really well respected, and so this is just like an example of how many like Italians are part of like our political framework and our political narrative. This migration that happened in the 1800s impacts our world to this day. Now there are 4 colonies the British had that had huge amounts of white people moving to. Like the British had Kenya, but there's not a lot of white people moving to Kenya. The British had India, but there weren't like tens of thousands of white people living in India that remained in India. But there are 4 colonies that they had where whites would become a significant percent of the population. The first one is Canada. Canada has so many white people move there, and so many Native people die because of disease that the Native American population of Canada is only 4%, which isn't very high. Australia is the second settler colony where a lot of white people moved. We talked about that just a moment ago. And the native Aborigines that are left, that our total population is only 3%. Only 3% of Australia is Aborigine today. Same reason for Native Americans. There was the disease, there was war, there was conflict, and they pushed off their land. New Zealand has done a bit better. New Zealand's indigenous Maori population is about 16%. We've talked about famous people who are at least part Maori, like Taika Waititi, the director of Thor Ragnarok, and Jojo Rabbit. So 16% are Maori, but it's a white majority nation. But the Maori have influenced New Zealand culture tremendously. I think I'll share a video of an example of how they've influenced New Zealand culture. South Africa is a real famous example, but South Africa is an example that's changed over time. Back in 1911, if you and I would have gone to South Africa in 1911, 21% of the people there were white. I mean, that's crazy to go to an African country and 1 out of every 5 people you see are white. I mean, that's not the case. Anytime I'm in Rwanda or Uganda or Kenya, if you see a white person, it's like a shocking thing. You're like, what are you doing here? It's like such a rare thing to see a white person. South Africa in 1911, 1 out of every 5 people were white. But that changes. South Africa was under apartheid rule. That was white minority rule over the black majority. And after apartheid ended, there was some whites who chose to leave South Africa, but also we see the growing population of the black majority. In 2004, the last year I have numbers, the white population of South Africa is 10%. So 1 out of every 10 people in South Africa is white. Some people have the misconception that South Africa is like an all-white nation. I've heard that before. About 10% of South Africa is white today, which isn't a lot, but again, compared to the rest of Africa, that's huge. Most Europeans who did move to the colonies had jobs. They were engineers or they're geologists. They had some sort of profession. If you're a white person moving to these colonies, you're not going to move to Africa unless you have a specific skill set. And so geologists were great because there's oil or there's gold or there's silver or there's something to be discovered. Geologists. And the second one is engineers. Because what are the Europeans going to want to build? They want to build railroads. They want to build networks of communication. We need engineers. And so those were the types of people that were European that usually made it their way over. Many British professionals, 100,000 of them at least, also I'm so sorry, I skipped one. They help spread Western technology. So if we have these engineers from the West moving to Africa, moving to India, they're spreading Western technology. And many British professionals, 100,000 of them, also settled in the South American nation that they had the most investment in. We've mentioned this in a previous lecture, that there was one South American country the British were really, really involved with. This is the one South American country is like the most modern, the most wealthiest. Their capital has been compared to to Paris, actually. And that was Argentina. 100,000 British people went to Argentina. There's still banks and businesses that were started by the British still to this day in Argentina. Okay, so finally, last section, broad overview. There's 2 types of migration we see at this time period. There's voluntary migration and there's forced migration. Examples of voluntary migration, the Italians, they moved to the United States and Argentina. They're choosing to go to the United States. They're choosing to go to Argentina. That is a first example of voluntary migrations. The Italians, they go to the United States, they go to Argentina. Why do they go? They go for better wages. They want to make more money and they're going to escape poverty. So that's the first example of voluntary migration, people who are moving all around the world, not because they have to, because they're choosing to do so. They go to places like the United States, Argentina, they're going for better wages, they want to escape poverty. Second example of a people group that voluntarily decide to move are the Japanese. One of the places that they go to that we study for our history is actually Hawaii. They're going to Hawaii. They sought financial opportunities. They thought that there would be opportunities for them to work in Hawaii, and they were right. They actually worked on sugar and pineapple plantations. So we see a lot of Japanese, even to this day, living in Hawaii, working on sugar and pineapple plantations. A third group of people who chose to move during this time people were the Chinese. The Chinese came to the United States. That's one specific example, and we know they worked on the railroad. They chose to come to the United States. One specific job they had was they worked on the railroad. The Irish are the fourth example of people who chose to move. They came to the United States. That's an example that we'll use, and they wanted to escape poverty as well. You know, the poverty, whether just from them being poor or from the famine that we talked about just a moment ago. And they worked construction. They worked construction and factories. You know, the Irish came and often worked these very low wage jobs. But even though they did work low wage jobs, we see it within a few generations, the Irish who were living in these tenements, this is something we discussed in another lecture, were moving their way out. So there's also an example of forced and semi-forced migration. Forced migration, like the best example of forced migration, are the African diaspora. They went to the Americas. We mentioned that in our lecture, and they worked on plantations. And this African diaspora, you might remember that they contributed to what we call the triangular trade, that they were Africans being brought over from Africa, they were being brought to the Americas, they harvested agricultural products, those products were sent raw materials to Europe, Europe processed those and manufactured them, and they sent them back to Africa. So these Africans contributed to triangular trade. A second example of forced migrants were white people. In fact, you might remember British convicts went to Australia. That's a second example of forced migration. Also, Indian indentured servants. So I called this section forced and semi-forced. These Indians were not forced, like sold into slavery, but the way they were treated was pretty bad. So we're going to put them as semi-forced. After the abolition of slavery, in particular, is when we see Indians being important in this types of labor. They were technically free, but they were taken advantage of. They were technically free, but they were taken advantage of. And there was one place as a focus that will give us an example where there's a huge amount of Indians to this day, working in the Caribbean. Okay, so after that, I've got 3 multiple choice questions. They're based on this map. Hopefully it should be super simple. Make sure you just put number 1 A, number 2 A, number 3 A, whatever your answer is. That should not take a long time. And let me just talk to you a little bit about these questions. These questions, 2 complete sentences is all you need. Number 1, it says, explain one historical situation in the period of 1750 to 1900 in which individuals freely chose to migrate. I think I've given you a lot of examples. You can tell me who chose to migrate and why they chose to migrate. 2 complete sentences would be great. And then number 2, and the last one situation where people were forced to migrate or semi-forced to migrate. So 2 complete sentences. Remember, you are 10th graders going to 11th grade. Some of you are going to ACE. Some of you are going to college classes. A lot of your responses need to reflect that you're big kids now. Your responses need to reflect that you're capable of doing these big things. I've had some people comment about the workload, but I have not received emails about the workload. I'm happy to talk with you. I think we have 2 assignments on average a week. And I'm happy to sort some of those things out. I think our new grading policy, there's no late points taken for anything. There was the new policy that was put out by the school district. So I'm doing my best to help you take this very real AP test, which includes curriculum on migration. So if you have questions or concerns, I totally want to hear that. I want to discuss that with you. I'm available on Teams to chat. I think maybe one person, Daniela, and maybe Abigail have chatted with me. Also, I think Blaze and Blair have chatted with me to ask questions. Maybe Josh in 4th period has. So maybe 6 or 7 people have actually asked me questions and we've chatted on Teams. So if you need help, I want to help you, but you can only get help if you ask for help and for us to work together. So I look forward with working with you again tomorrow for our last lecture, our last bit of material. Wednesday, we'll have an online review, and make sure you're keeping up with some of the Remind stuff that I'm putting out. I think in 10 minutes, there's a live review on YouTube. That is going to be great. So email me. Let's talk. I look forward to hearing from some of you guys. Thanks a lot. Bye.